Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Last night, we clearly didn't have enough time to get through our lecture material, which is, again, not necessarily a bad thing, but that is what we're going to be doing today, what I'm going to be doing today. One thing to note is that in the modality that is an asynchronous recorded lecture, I'm going to move through some things a little bit more quickly than I typically would, just because we don't have that opportunity for audience feedback or engagement. So if you have questions about anything, please make sure that you reach out. You can email me or message me on Canvas. All right, I'm going to screen share with all of you right now. So you should be seeing that on the video. All right, so we are talking about informative speaking. Informative speaking is, from my view, really the most used form of public speaking. Most of our TED Talks are specifically or ideally informative speaking when we are teaching somebody something, when we are training somebody at work, when we are doing something where we're simply just trying to transfer knowledge or information from our mind to the mind of our audience, we are engaged in informative speaking. And this is definitely the thing that you're going to do the most as a student. But if we think about it from not necessarily a public speaking perspective and think about it more from a communication perspective, it can be really beneficial in creating clarity in some of those miscommunications, especially if we think back to the transactional model. So to start to go through this, we are going to talk about the different purposes of informative speaking. There are three, they're pretty simple. We'll then talk about the four different types of information, four different types of speeches. We'll briefly review the organizational patterns. Then I'll give you some really quick, easy tips for effective informative speaking. And that'll get us to our review. Quick side note here. I don't know if you've noticed, but I had my attention gaining device, my thesis, and now I have my preview. So in terms of structure, I'm following our class structure. Just wanted to highlight that really briefly. Okay, so when we look at the purposes of informative speaking, they really are quite simple. The first one you can probably imagine is provide people with knowledge. This is a general idea. We are trying to get the information, the knowledge from our mind to the mind of our audience. Now, we've talked about the transactional model, that sender crafting the message, encoding it with meaning based on the channel, sending that message out to the receivers and decoding that or translating it. There's those different contextual elements, the different elements of noise. We have the different elements of worldview that come into play. So providing people with knowledge is not as simple as just putting the information out there, right? One of my favorite things people say is that information is neutral, or here's this information, do with it what you will, make your own decision. Well, that is just fundamentally not how it works, right? We are crafting a message to try and provide knowledge, provide information to our audience. And it's not a situation where we're simply, writing a note, giving it to somebody. They're looking at that note and taking it in and then potentially giving something back to us, right? It's not purely transactional. This idea of knowledge transfer in this very much kind of transactional, like a pure transaction when we go to the store and purchase something, is referred to as the banking style of education. So if you think about a lot of our public education, at least from when I was in school, a lot of what happens is teachers will take information and deposit it on in the students, and then the students are required to kind of regurgitate that knowledge. And one thing that we know is that that's not necessarily the best way to go about teaching critical thinking. Because as you can probably relate to, when we have those exams, when we have those quizzes, one of the things we tend to do is cram all this information and then dump it right after. So we're not really retaining a lot of information. So when we're thinking about informative speaking, the goal is to get our audience to retain that information. So we would have to be very purposeful about how we're going about that, because it's the primary purpose of what we're trying to achieve here. We are providing people with knowledge. The second thing that we're doing through informative speaking is shaping perceptions. Now, this is one of those things that I find very interesting, because in the US, we tend to frown upon the idea that people will change their perspective, right? We call people hypocrites, politicians if they change a stance. We call them, flip floppers. There's a number of different things, but it largely circles back to our credibility and our ethos. And I find this very interesting because, from a logical, reasonable perspective, knowledge, information should shape our perceptions, right? When I learn something new, it should change the way I think about that thing. That just makes sense. At least it does to me. For example, if I am trying to understand something about nutrition and my personal health, I go to the doctor, I get some blood work done. The doctor says, hey, your blood sugar's a little bit high. We need to do something about that. And up until that point, I wasn't aware that the way that I was eating or my diet was negatively impacting my blood sugar. So I then I talk to a nutritionist, I learn about sugar and the effects on the body, and then I learn about all the other elements of how sugar impacts the body. And then I make a more informed, reasonable judgment, critical thinking, right? Make a reasonable judgment about how I want to live my life moving forward. And that knowledge has inherently shaped my perceptions. So it's very, very important that we're thinking about not only that we're providing knowledge, but we're thinking about how that knowledge is going to benefit our audience, is going to be ethical, is going to be logical, is going to be reasonable, because we don't want to provide information to our audience that is going to shape their perceptions in a negative way, right? The goal is to improve our audience's lives. So we have to understand that providing information is inherently going to shape perceptions. It is not neutral. It is not amoral, right? We really have to think about that. The third element here is that information is going to enhance our ability to survive and evolve. Now, this general concept took me a while to come around to, largely because the rhetorician in me wants to pick this apart about what it means to enhance our ability to survive and evolve. But if I kind of take myself out of my balcony stance a little bit, I try to be a little bit more reasonable and less critical. It makes sense, right? When we're sharing information, we are hopefully sharing information to benefit our audience's lives, to benefit people's lives. Um, this is largely how human beings have been communicating for a long time. When people in the past were sharing stories and passing information from generation to generation to generation, before language was invented, written language was invented, they were sharing information in the form of a story that was passed down from generation to generation. And that information was largely used to help those people continue to be successful in whatever it is that they were doing, right? Living longer, healthier, happier lives. So when we're thinking about information, one way that I like to think about this, and I got this from a professor at Sac State, is to think about it like a gift, right? If you get a gift for somebody, say you go to the store, you get a gift, you put it in one of those really nice fancy plastic bags that they come with, and you take it to that person and you just hand them the bag with the gift in it. And you say, "Hey, I got this gift for you." It's like, "Oh, cool. Thanks. This is actually not nice, but like the plastic bag's kind of throwing me off a little bit. Like I appreciate it, but I'm not really I'm not really sure about this, right?" And it's a completely different thing if you get the gift, you put in the time, the energy, the effort to wrap it, to get a card, right? To do those little extra elements. When you give it to that person, it's a much different reception of that gift. So if you think about your information like you're giving a gift, I think it'll change the way that we think about informative speaking. It takes more work, it takes more energy, but if you think about it like providing information that is beneficial, that is valuable, that is going to benefit your audience, shape their perceptions in a reasonable way, and then ultimately provide that knowledge. I think it'll really go a long way in improving the approach to informative speaking, because it's not just about dumping information. One way that we can do that is be very purposeful about how we go about it. Thinking about a gift, You find a gift, you get it for the right gift for the right person at the right time. We're very purposeful about it, right? Same thing with informative speaking. So we need to think about the different types of information. This, I think, is actually quite simple. We have 4 different types of information. Number 1, these are objects. Objects are tangible things. Rubik's cubes. This little anchor thing was actually a gift that was given to me by my mother-in-law. You slide it on a book and it holds the pages open so that you don't have to do that. Or if you're trying to cite something, you don't have to worry about holding it open. Handy dandy highlighter, thumb drive, water bottle. There's a number of things. Any object, anything that's tangible, anything that exists in kind of that constructed reality, that's going to function as an object. The second type of information, these are processes. So processes are the steps to complete a task. How do we do something? The challenging thing about processes is that we tend to say, first you do this, and then 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 this. And at this point, we've stopped listening, right? It's too many steps. So we have to think about, how do we make a process approachable, accessible, easy to digest, and memorable? Oftentimes we don't think about this. We kind of just go through the motions with this. I worked at Starbucks for a year, and when I worked there, my training was one day, one full 8-hour shift, basically, of just being bombarded with every single process that I would need to know how to do while working at Starbucks. And then my first shift, the expectation was, oh, you went through training, you know how to do this. Well, that's not the case, right? That's not how we learn. That's not how we process information. So we really have to think about, how do we make that information approachable, and how do we think about it in a way that makes that process something that will stick with us? One thing we can do is connect it to the appropriate type of speech and the appropriate organizational pattern, which we'll talk about in a second. Our third type of information, these are events. So events are things that have happened, are happening. I'm hesitant to say will happen, because anytime somebody starts predicting something, that should be a little bit of a red flag, but particularly things that have happened and are happening. So the general things we need to talk about are the practical details: the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, the how, right? Those practical details. If we think about historical events, we want to know who, what, when, where, why, how, right? What was the context? What was the reasoning for that event? Why did it happen that way? And so when we learn about an event, we need to know that particular information. And then the fourth type of information, these are concepts. Concepts we should be really comfortable with. They're crafted by language. They largely exist in that constructed reality. So if we go back to Aristotle's first use of rhetoric, truth and justice, those are concepts, right? Language has different conceptual elements. Language in and of itself is a concept. There's many concepts that we interact with on a daily basis. We're talking about a number of them right now. So concepts are things that are largely constructed by language. And so if we're doing informative speech, or we're doing some kind of informative communication about concepts, we really have to be purposeful about those symbols that we're using to craft that message, i.e., our language. So once we identify the type of information, just like a gift, we identify what we want to get, then we have to think about, how are we going to package that gift? And that's where we think about the types of speeches. So we have 4 different types of informative speeches we can do. I'll go through all 4, and then I'll circle back and give you an example of how each different type of speech can get us to a different place about the same topic. So to start, we have definitional speeches. Definitional speeches are functionally making what we call an argument of definition. So an argument of definition argues how we should categorize something or determine what it is. So when we make a speech of definition, we are categorizing something or arguing what something is, generally how we should think about something differently. So just a quick example here: if we are doing a definitional speech and we want to talk about a concept, I could talk about the concept of justice, right? And then redefine justice and how we should approach justice, right? The second type of speech is descriptive. Now, descriptive speeches are very detailed. They're very focused. They're very what we would call microscopic. So if you think about zooming in on something. So you have the GPS app or a GPS app. When you zoom in, right, on your neighborhood, you can see more of the details, but you can see less of the surrounding area. So a descriptive type of speech is very focused on a particular thing. So, for example, if I wanted to talk about a particular event, I could describe that event. I could describe a historical event in extreme detail and talk about specifically that event without necessarily talking about the other things that are going on in the world or even the contextual things that led up to that event. Our third type of speech is an explanatory speech. Explanatory speeches are more broad. So if a descriptive speech is very focused, an explanatory speech is going to be less focused. It's going to be zoomed out, right? So we're going to zoom in and then we're going to zoom out. We're getting some distance. We're putting ourselves in that balcony stance. Explanatory speeches are what we would call macroscopic. So they have a larger view. Explanatory speeches are going to look at things with a little bit less depth, but more breadth. So descriptive speeches are going to go deep. Explanatory speeches are going to go wide with what they're talking about. So if I am, say, looking at that historical event, maybe rather than focus on describing that individual event, I want to look at the other elements that led up to that event. I want to explain it. So if you remember, we were talking about nuclear energy and those nuclear disasters. I could focus on one individual thing that happened for a descriptive speech at, say, 3 Mile Island, or I could explain maybe the larger contextual, cultural, sociocultural, political, economic situations or elements that impacted that particular disaster and gain more breadth, more a general understanding of what happened versus describing that individual event. And then our last type of speech is a demonstrational speech. Now, demonstrational speeches are where we show how to complete a process. So processes are largely going to be demonstrated. I am currently demonstrating how to complete the process of producing an informative speech or improving our informative communication skills. So when we demonstrate something, we demonstrate how to complete a process. So any process, we can demonstrate how to do that. Could I explain it or describe it? Absolutely. But there are some things that are more functional in terms of demonstrating. One thing that I always like to highlight with this, because I will typically ask people, how many of you like listening to or engaging with demonstrational speeches about processes? And most times students are not super excited, right? If I were to say, oh, we're gonna watch this thing that's going to demonstrate how to complete this process, probably wouldn't really like that very much. But then if I twist it and I say, how many of you like to watch cooking shows or cooking competitions? That changes things a little bit, right? Because we are largely engaged in demonstrational speaking. If you watch Top Chef, Master Chef, Next Level Chef, Chopped, any cooking show, especially if you watch a cooking show where you are directly learning how to make something, you are engaged in informative speaking. They are demonstrating how to complete a process. So if we look at these types of information and these types of speeches, we can see that there are some general connections. But there's one type of information I haven't talked about yet, and that's an object. So the object that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to use for all 4 types of speeches. The object I'm going to talk about is a cheeseburger. Now, this might seem a little bit odd, but I think it works really well for this particular example. Most people are familiar with what a cheeseburger is. So the topic here is a cheeseburger. If I want to do a definitional speech, I could do an informative speech about what makes a cheeseburger a cheeseburger. How do we categorize it? How do we define it? What is it? Well, when I think of a cheeseburger, I think of a bun, a patty, typically beef, because when it's something else, we call it a turkey burger, a veggie burger, a salmon burger. If we call it chicken, we call it a sandwich, which really doesn't make any sense if you stop to think about it, but we won't. And then cheese, And then the way I think about it is typically lettuce, tomato, onion, and some kind of sauce. That's how I would define a cheeseburger. Now, that's not how everybody would define a cheeseburger. And this is something that was interesting to me because when I was coaching debate at Sac State, we were in Wisconsin for a debate tournament. And I learned that in Wisconsin, a cheeseburger is bun, meat, cheese. That's it. I learned this because I went to a restaurant and I ordered a cheeseburger, and that's what they brought me out. And I was like, "Well, can I get some vegetables for this?" And they said, "Oh, you you must be from California." I said, "Actually, I am. How did you know that?" They said, "Well, we don't put rabbit food on our cheeseburgers here." And I laughed, and it was admittedly kind of a rude comment, but I laughed about it. And they were like, and I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, can I get some vegetables?" They said, "Sure. Do you want avocado as well?" And I was like, "Yeah, why not if you've got it?" And they were like, "No, I was being sarcastic. We don't have avocado here." So one thing I learned and have since corroborated is that in Wisconsin, they don't put vegetables on their cheeseburgers. Maybe grilled onion, maybe some ketchup, but that's it. So definitional speeches largely function to construct the way that we understand different things in the world. So we can do a definitional speech about a cheeseburger, but we could also do a descriptive speech about a cheeseburger. I could describe to you a cheeseburger that I had recently that was really good. Well, if I'm thinking about that one individual experience, I'm going to talk about where it was, who I was with, what time of day it was, what made that individual cheeseburger so good. How was it cooked? What was on it? I'm going to describe that individual event in extreme detail. That's very different from an explanatory speech where I could be talking to somebody and they could say, "Well, I don't really get uh, the US obsession with cheeseburgers. Like what's the deal? I don't get it." And then I could potentially explain the cultural phenomenon or the cultural impact that a cheeseburger has had on the United States. In my mind, specifically, I would talk about McDonald's. Because McDonald's was, as far as I know, the first fast food restaurant and fundamentally changed the world in its creation and then its development and explosion. And it sold cheeseburgers. And it was founded, and I want to say actually, I don't remember where it was founded actually, but it was in California, I believe, maybe Arizona. Anyways, I could explain the cultural impact that McDonald's has had on the United States, but also on the world. And last but not least, I could demonstrate how to make a cheeseburger. I could show you how to do it. I could also demonstrate how to eat a cheeseburger. I'm not going to do that, but we could do any one of these types of speeches with that particular object. So depending on what you're talking about, this is going to vary. The important thing is that we think about the type of information we want to talk about. So that's our gift. We want to think about the type of speech. So how are we initially wrapping that gift? And then our organizational pattern is our little bow on top, when we make sure that we have everything buttoned up, dialed in, and connected. When we look at our organizational patterns, these are going to vary depending on our topic, the type of information, and the type of speech. So just really quickly to review, spatial organizational patterns organize your points based on passage through space. Chronological, organize points based on passage through time. Cause and effect, or what I call causal, relates to a cause and effect relationship, which we want to be careful with. We then talked about problem solution. So we highlight a problem, we highlight a solution or set of solutions. And then we had topical organizational patterns allow you to choose whatever you want. You just have to create that connection between them, between your points. I call this the low hanging fruit because it's really easy to start, but it's hard to do well. And then the one that's missing is comparative. So just to give you an example here, I could say, do a speech about the invention of McDonald's, and that's an event. And that I could then explain the cultural impact of that through a chronological organizational pattern, highlighting key points in time where McDonald's did things that fundamentally changed the landscape of culture in the United States and ultimately culture around the world. So it depends on what you're talking about. But if you connect these three things, type of information you're present, type of speech, your gift wrap, organizational pattern. This is going to be, your fancy details, your cards, that kind of thing. You ultimately create information that is hopefully a pleasure to receive and it makes sense. There are some things that we have to be aware of, though, in terms of informative speaking. Number one is that we don't want to do too much, right? Less is more. We want to avoid information overload. Having one really great gift is better than having 10 meh gifts. Now, that's largely, subjective, but when we're thinking about informational speaking, the thing we want to avoid is bombarding our audience with information. We do not remember information that way. You all know this, right? When you sit down in a class, I apologize when I come from the chemistry professors here, but when you sit down in a class, you sit down in chemistry and they lecture at you for 3 straight hours, how much are you retaining? Not very much, right? So we have to really think about what information does my audience need to know and keep it at that. We don't want to have too much information thrown at us. Number two is reward the audience. And I don't mean, Oprah here, right? You get a car, you get a car, you get a car. I mean, think about how you can make that information beneficial to your audience. Make it so that they want to listen to you. You are rewarding them essentially for listening by making that information beneficial to their life. You have to repeat things. So you have to say it and say it and say it and say it and say it again. In this class, you are going to say it in your introduction. You're going to say it in your main points. You're going to say it again in your conclusion. If you follow that structure, our audience will be exposed to those ideas at least 3 times, which is good. We need repetition. Think about your day-to-day life, right? You as a person, you're not a computer. You don't record everything the first time it's said to you. So you really have to think about, how do I make that functional? Tip number 4 here, use humor really wisely. This has been a common theme in this class, but in terms of informative speaking, it's okay to be taken seriously. We want to share information. We want to be taken seriously in doing that. So I would say avoid humor. Number 5, check for understanding. Now, not necessarily in your 5-minute speech for this class or your 8-minute speech for this class, but for your longer speeches. Check for understanding. Does it make sense? Does this make sense? Does this make sense? Click a reaction if, raise a hand if, right? Take moments, take opportunities to check for understanding with your audience. It's really important. The next one here is to build on what your audience already knows. And I have already been doing this. So just to backtrack a little bit here, if we get to when I was talking about cheeseburgers, I had a faculty reviewer one time tell me that I should not talk about cheeseburgers because it's not academic enough. And I said, well, it makes sense though. And I'm building on what my audience already knows. I'm confident that everybody knows what a cheeseburger is. I said, well, you should do something else that's a little bit more challenging, a little bit more suitable for a college environment. Obviously, I'm still feeling a little bit petty about that. That's why I'm telling that story. So to be determined on how the cheeseburger example went, I'll definitely ask you about it on Tuesday. So in review, we have reviewed the 3 purposes of informative speaking, the 4 different types of information, that's our gift, the 4 different types of speeches, that's our gift wrap. We reviewed the organizational patterns, that's our accessories to the gift, our card, and then we talked about some of the different tips. The number 1 tip for effective informative speaking is to avoid information overload. Don't bombard us with a whole bunch of information. We will not be able to remember all of it. And that concludes our lecture on informative speaking. If you all have questions, please reach out. Otherwise, have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday. Bye, everybody.